Bruce Hudson, landscape architect, founder of Landscape Heritage Southern Africa, director of New World Associates.
Now, and yeah, let's start. Who needs an HIA? Well, the way I feel about it, it's like who wants to be a heritage planner? Who wants to play double jeopardy? And can I call a friend to answer any of those questions? In my experience, many might shudder or even wince at the thought of HIA, IACOM, and Heritage Western Cape. So you can see my experiences relating to my practice here in Cape Town. And who needs a VIA? All large-scale projects need a VIA at the very least. And did anyone ever read the VIA? I often wonder if the VIAs that I write are written. Do Heritage Western Cape officials or IACOM even have time to read half the reports that they receive? One might wonder sometimes at the questions that they ask. Now, who cares about the landscape? You know, landscape is an overused word and it's an underused word in heritage, and is a landscape only a landscape if it's a cultural landscape? Do only cultural landscapes count in heritage? And what is a cultural landscape anyway? If it's only a landscape, does it even need an HIA? I sometimes wonder. So is the practice of HIA backward compared to EIA? And having practiced EIA for 15 years, having written EIA reports to World Bank standards, and having no problems with DEA on EIAs or VIAs, yet having been told by Heritage Western Cape how to write an HIA, I sometimes wonder about that too. So does this add up to an ethical or a technical or an administrative problem in HIA? Should the same consultants who submit HIAs be the same as those who review HIAs? Can you really just recuse yourself from the seat of judgment when your HIA comes up? And do IACOM members' HIAs always meet the standards of an HIA? I wonder about that a lot. So I'm not talking about that, but those are some of my thoughts when I thought about the ethics of HIA and as I've experienced them. So let me get back to the problem that I initially posited and which I'm really going to speak about. But what I said before is the background to it. Other titles I could have used is heritage minus landscape. I didn't think of it. Heritage minus landscape with a symbol. I think that would have been misunderstood. Or the uncultivated landscape, but more on that later. I never thought of any of that. I like making controversial statements. I'm sure you already realized that. But what is heritage without landscape? Is there any such thing as heritage without landscape? If not, what is landscape heritage, and how well is it included in heritage? And how cultivated is heritage without a cultivated landscape? What even is cultivation? Well, you might find some of this pretty strange. In fact, it's only something I've been looking into quite closely recently. So that's how it ended up in this presentation. This is where I started off a few months ago when I offered to do the talk. A perennial conflict between development pressure, the planning environment, and landscape heritage value. And I called it naked heritage. So these are my primary points. Is landscape is traditionally undervalued in development. Plants are considered of little to no consequence and completely replaceable. And trees are regularly felled or squeezed into tiny, unviable spaces, regardless of their size, age, species, or condition, especially in the Western Cape, where a policy of densification is removing any room for landscape past and present. And it is the landscape past that is of great concern, because there are two aspects of landscape heritage that are being irreversibly destroyed by these policies and practices. But it is also landscape future. What kind of landscapes are we making? So where is the heritage conflict here in what sounds like a straightforward landscape values debate? Now, the primary attributes of landscape can be reduced to two highly significant landscape features, namely the landscape space itself and the most irreplaceable features of all, the trees, which often outlive any other planting on site. There is a more fundamental problem with even recognizing landscape heritage value in the NHRA itself, which is a very spotty and incomplete recognition of landscape heritage, and is further exacerbated by the lack of landscape heritage professionals in the professional heritage community itself. So how can you expect architects and archaeologists, town planners and historians to know and recognize different plant and tree species or their value? And how can these primary landscape heritage assets be conserved if they are not even mapped? It seems to me that heritage surveys themselves are literally blind to the value of landscape, either by virtue of those conducting the assessments or by the original mandate from the authorities calling for the heritage to be assessed without or even specifically ignoring its primary landscape attributes. So this was a district survey, a Swartland Rural Heritage Survey, and these farms have been graded and highlighted based on the homestead, but not the farmland. I found that quite odd. I'm just going to take you through this quickly. These are images that you're all aware of. The city of Cape Town's heritage maps. And you can see, yeah, they're very busy. Table Mountain is there. Quite a lot of open spaces are there, I'm glad to say. Even heritage protection overlay zones. I don't even know what all of these terms mean. But when it comes down to the heritage inventory and heritage objects, you'll see that heritage objects are becoming fewer and fewer. I'm very glad to see, but this is Cape Town. There are a lot of graded open spaces, but what about the rest? And when we look here at the heritage inventory objects, they're all buildings. As a landscape architect, I always look at that. Buildings, but not landscapes. So is a landscape an object? Not really. This is the national system, SARUS. These were cultural landscapes of the Western Cape. SARUS doesn't even deal with landscapes. Not that I could find. Points, and I'll note here that there are points, not areas. Once again, this was for the whole country. And that's a bit of a shocker. There are only 3 or 4. Most of them were in the Western Cape and Mapungubwe, I presume that is. And once again, points, not areas. So where is the landscape heritage at a national level? So continuing to answer this question, if this is not a fundamental problem in heritage planning and the ethics of it, then what is it? Then what is? The landscape is literally the biggest feature of heritage, but heritage seems to be so often largely reduced to an intense and narrow discussion of ancient bones and stones or rebuildable historic structures, with little consideration of the wider landscape and its component aspect of landscape heritage. Now, I know this last comment is a little controversial, but imagine if a landscape architect had to compile the above maps, what they would look like, and not an archaeologist or an architect. Imagine if they were archaeology ultralight and architecture zero, because that's how heritage seems to be. Landscape light, landscape ultralight, and landscape zero. Or should we rely on sand parks to look after our landscapes, like they look after Devil's Peak or Tokai Forest? Should we let sand be, or forestry, conserve the gums and pines of South Africa, or the gum trees of our farms and roads? In what way is heritage looking after landscape and landscape heritage assets, nationally, provincially, or locally? I'm asking a lot of questions here, and some of them I'm answering. Now, you cannot replace a 100-year-old tree or even a 50-year-old tree as you can an historic structure. And you can never gain back the historic open space or even urban open space once you have built on it, unless you demolish it, of course, as many trees are regularly felled. So let's talk about development pressure. what is landscape value in terms of plants and trees? So, plants are considered of little or no consequence and completely replaceable. I can say that after 30 plus years in the field and 40 plus years since I started studying. After all, what is the value of a shrub? 50 Rand in the bag, 100 Rand in the ground. The Rand or dollar value is negligible. Trees, on the other hand, are regularly felled or squeezed into tiny, unviable space. I think I said this already, regardless of their size, age, species, or condition, especially in the Western Cape, where policy of densification is removing any room for landscape past and present, and who protects them. How are plants valued in heritage planning? Plants are undervalued, they're under-recognized and underrated, it goes without saying. And is there a landscape committee at Heritage Western Cape, like there is archaeology? Are plants considered a national heritage concern? Would architects be on it, or archaeologists? How highly are trees recognized? Trees can easily be felled and small fines paid, or considered common and replaceable, but are they? Trees are a form of living heritage that is not understood in the NHRA. Now, it is the landscape past that is of great concern, because there are two aspects of landscape heritage that are being irreversibly destroyed by these policies and practices. But what is the timeline for the value of a plant, for the value of a tree? Is it 60 years? That's the general protection for buildings. Developers demolish old buildings for breakfast. They fell trees for lunch and strip sites for starters. It's only a garden, it's only a tree. What value does a garden or a tree or a forest have? Wood, compost, is that its value? How old is a landscape, and how old are its components? How old is the space, place, or landscape under consideration? Not the buildings, the landscape, the land. How old is it? How old is its context, component features, plants, and trees? What is their significance, and to whom? Do not landscapes and plants have any significance in the heritage of our society? I'm asking a lot of questions here, and that was just from the development side. When I come to the planning environment, I have to say, on the NHRA and landscape has an incomplete and uncomfortable to decidedly partial relationship with landscape. And I've written a long paper on this. It's discriminatory against landscape. It's a kind of landscape heritage apartheid, in my view, where you've got cultural landscapes versus landscape. You've got built environment versus plant environment. You've got architectural versus agricultural, and construction versus cultivation. There is a distinct dominance there. So let's just look at some information on landscapes. And there's not a lot of landscape information available because it has never been done. But this is something called land cover. And this is just what's called level 1, which has only got 9 classes, which are those you can see in the key on the right-hand side. And level 2 has got 24, I think, classes, and level 3 has got 73 classes. And I'm afraid this is the subject for a whole other presentation. We're going to look at it briefly. These are land cover statistics of what I've called naked heritage, because I sometimes wonder what is left of our heritage. Let's see here, what is the land or landscape cover of the Western Cape? It is shrubland, 70%, that's fynbos and karoo. Cultivated farms, 17%, forested, 6%, barren, what that just means bare land, 3% grassland. By the time you get to the built environment, it's 0.8%. I hope that you're beginning to understand why my blood begins to boil about the things that are considered important in heritage in the NHRA and at Heritage Western Cape, because they spend most of their time looking at 0.8% of the country, of the province. So let's just group those together. Most of that falls under the natural landscape, which is about 82%. Not all those water bodies are natural, by the way. Probably most of them are not. Agricultural, call it 18%, urban 0.8%. Mines have a very small area. What about landform? We don't have landform maps of the country, and it's very hard to include all these multiple aspects of landscape, but there's a whole bunch of landform issues, which are very important in heritage, but they're not covered by any kind of body, statutory instrument, act, law, whatever that I can think of. Not specifically, and certainly not in heritage. So this is the way I think, and it might seem a bit odd to you, but I have a very hierarchical, kind of structured way of thinking about things. I look here, let's just see what is the natural landscape made of and the cultural landscape, because these are considered to be the sort of the two extremes of landscape. The natural landscape, you can see there are those four areas: meteorology or climate, geology, and landform, hydrology, and ecology. And then you've got the cultural landscape, which is anthropology and landscape. But there are a lot of landscapes here that should actually be considered by heritage, but they're not. They're handled by other departments. So just jumping in here with another list, which you will recognize comes from the provincial government of the Western Cape's guideline for heritage impact assessment. And they listed 12 kinds of heritage contexts, as they call it, with their terminology. And you can see that the natural landscape is item 6, and the scenic landscape is item number 6 on the second list, or item number 12. There's a lot of historical, 5 historical headings, 4 archaeological headings, you could call them, and 1 of associated landscape. So that gives you an idea of how people in the Western Cape view heritage context, as they call it, but heritage landscape. So I realized in writing this that there's a big problem with the wording that we use, and it's so implicit in the acts and in the guidelines that you can't get away from it. So I'm changing this from the planning environment to the planted environment, but we're not going to end there. And as I've noted, the natural landscapes, the planted environment covers everything from natural landscapes to cultural landscapes and every landscape in between. And I've come to view the landscape as having these 6, I think that's 6 major kinds of landscape: natural landscapes, agricultural landscapes, horticultural landscapes, silvicultural landscapes, herbicultural landscapes, and viticultural landscapes. And we're going to go through those quickly. Looking at those headings again, we've got the planted environment. Planted, another word for planted is cultivated, and another word for environment is landscape. I'm going to talk about that now. So we've got the agricultural or cultivated landscape, because that's what makes it agricultural. It is cultivated. So we've got agricultural landscapes, and these are subdivided according to various criteria. Agricultural landscapes are in some systems considered to cover all other forms of planting. Not in my book, but I'll just show you how some of those breakdowns go. Agricultural landscapes, which we think of as farmland; horticultural landscapes, which I think is what we think of as landscaping; arboricultural landscapes, which is the treed landscape; herbicultural, which is a term I've coined to cover urban areas; silvicultural, that's forests, plantations in particular; and viticultural landscapes, which is the winelands that's of particular interest in the Cape. So the agricultural landscape is defined apparently. I found this quite interesting. I didn't know it. It is farming and landscape. It is cultivating farms. It's defined by having livestock and crops, and it's generally large scale. So then you, in terms of the way land cover looks at it, it's annual, it's perennial, it's permanent, and it's irrigated or dry land. And here I just make that note again, that homesteads, as heritage likes to grade buildings, does not equal farms and fields. So you cannot grade a farming region or a farm based on the value of the homestead or the grading of the homestead. The horticultural landscape, I think that's the one most people think is landscaping, and that's what landscape should confine itself to. There's gardening in the landscape or cultivating gardens. So notice the heading there is now the cultivated landscape, and it really does come from agriculture. And the difference is that with agriculture and horticulture, it's crops only and no livestock, and it's small scale generally, once again, annual or perennial or permanent. In this country, in South Africa, I don't consider some of these aspects of horticulture as being exclusively small scale. If I think of a lot of the unique crops we have here, like sugarcane or apples and the deciduous fruit industry, these are actually large scale. So there's some borderline stuff there and some argument there for including horticultural landscapes under agricultural landscapes. The arboricultural landscape, we study arboriculture at university. This is trees and the landscape, cultivating trees. And there are different kinds of trees. This is just a selection that I put there: street trees, park trees, garden trees, shade trees, and windbreak trees. Herbicultural landscapes, once again, this is really the field of landscape architecture and what I like to call cultivating cities. It really did help clarify my mind. What am I talking about when I talk about landscape as a landscape architect, the way I was trained, and then how I came into heritage planning, and why I think there's such a clash on these terms. And you can subdivide this in various ways. You have urban landscapes and suburban landscapes. I'm not going to worry too much about the categorization. And I have to stick this in here. It doesn't go in anywhere. The ingenial landscape for engineering, and this is another aspect of building, and I'm not even talking about architecture here. I'm talking about things that affect the landscape, not townscape per se. And these are communications landscapes and water or hydrological landscapes. And so it was quite interesting. Graham's example was about an airport, and a very fine looking building. I also would have been sorry to see it go. One does become attached to old buildings, but no one seems to be so attached to the old trees, do they? The cultivated landscape, the silvicultural landscape. This is what we call forestry in common parlance, cultivating forests. And a cultivated forest is not called a forest, it's called a plantation. And they are primarily divided into hardwood plantations. This is in South Africa, which is gum trees, and softwood plantations, which is pine trees. And there's some experimental planting with indigenous plantations, which is primarily yellowwoods and possibly other species. I think it's almost finally the viticultural landscape, which is cultivating vines, which is edible grapes or table grapes, and wine grapes. And I think of most interest to heritage is possibly old vines. This is an aspect of winemaking that has come to the fore recently, and these lovely terms, terroir. This is very much a landscape term, isn't it? And the French for landscape, le paysage, we'd never hear it really here. And so we have heritage vineyards, which are associated with those old vines. And that is a very interesting study in itself. And finally, we have the scene landscape, the visual landscape. And I'm just breaking it down briefly here. Visual landscapes, that's what's visible. This is what I do a lot of in VIAs. What's aesthetic, we also cover the appreciated landscape in terms of natural and cultural. And tourist landscapes, I can't say I've done a lot of it, but in general, this is a very, very big issue in my opinion, especially when you live in a highly scenic country like South Africa and the coastal zones. So I think the value of landscape for tourism is actually overlooked in heritage. The summary, yes, I'm racing through this, and I hope that you're still with me. The solution. So I would like to sort of change some of these terms, which I spent a lot of time thinking about it and playing with words and realizing that I've got some words and some concepts in my vocabulary which I've just inherited. And so the planted environment, this is as opposed to the built environment that heritage is dominated by. Let's talk about the planted environment, which I say is equal to the cultivated landscape. And this is the difference between an environment and a landscape. So you've got the built environment, which is dominated by construction, not cultivation. the planted environment, which is the condition of planted and created landscapes, and the cultivated landscape, which I feel is about recognizing the cultivated landscape, and something I sort of taught myself while I was writing about preparing this talk. So it's not and I have a science degree, a biological sciences degree. It is not an environment in a biological sense, but it's a landscape in a cultural, visual, and aesthetic sense. And I would like that to be a real take-home for people today, is the terminology that is used in the NHRA, in common parlance, and the sort of way we speak in the late 20th century. Well, it's not even the early 21st century anymore, but most of the people in heritage got both feet firmly in the 20th century. And this is where a lot of this biological terminology has infiltrated other fields like heritage. So in my opinion, NHRA needs an overall that should be inclusive of plants and landscape, which is equal to landscape heritage. Heritage surveys need to be inclusive of plants and landscape, which is equal to landscape heritage. And in terms of landscape recognition, heritage needs to become inclusive of plants and landscape, which is equal to landscape heritage. That is, authorities and acts, cities and consultants, provinces and role players need to understand what the cultivated landscape and landscape heritage is all about. And just coming back to this point, landscape heritage does not equal biological heritage. And this is a very, very big concern to me. And I've realized that as I try to think about landscape heritage in recent years and try to articulate the subject, and I see travesties of landscape happening around me, such as the fire on Devil's Peak, which caused the destruction of the forests around UCT, the clearance of forests around Takai, and not only Takai, elsewhere, and the kind of approach that sand parks, who are biologically oriented, have towards heritage and trees, and the fact that nobody is really speaking with a clear voice about landscape heritage. And quite frankly, I don't think architects and archaeologists are competent to speak about it. And that's why there's a big gap in heritage to speak about landscape heritage and the value of landscape. So the Department of Agriculture cannot manage landscape heritage, and agricultural heritage is 18% of the Western Cape. And if nobody thinks that the Boerland or the Swartland are significant cultural landscapes, then I think they really need to think again. But it's not clear in any of the heritage surveys. National parks cannot manage landscape heritage because, once again, they are very much wildlife oriented, although they are changing. They nevertheless manage massive landscape heritage areas. Forestry cannot manage landscape heritage because forestry is just a product to them. It's an agricultural crop. But forestry has a big impact on people, has a big impact on the touristic or scenic value of a province. And you think of KwaZulu-Natal, parts of Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, and the Western Cape. So heritage must manage landscape heritage. I don't know how. Somehow this subject has to be tackled, and that's what I'm trying to do here. So what are we doing here? Landscape heritage. The organization I started, we have created something called the Landscape Map and Landscapedia. It's got 10 layers in it. Aim is to provide free access to landscape heritage information. So it's housed on Google My Maps. It's easily accessed on your mobile through Google Maps, providing on-site information in the landscape. And it's community heritage with shared mapping, something like iNaturalist, but iLandscape. And it's a work in progress. This is the map of Africa. I mean, I had no idea. There are so many thousands. There are something like 1,800 national parks, nature reserves, and I can't tell you how many kinds of natural reserve, which are protected landscapes there are in sub-equatorial Africa. It's a huge map. And it's not complete. This is just my work. This is all the range of landscapes in the Cape Town area. You can see it's not complete. but it's an attempt to start looking at landscape seriously. This is Simonstown, was for fun. There's the old coastline of Simonstown, some of the historic landscapes, which people don't know that they're there anymore. Such as, did you know there was a company gardens in Simonstown? Well, there it is on the left. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but that's where it is. And this is also, I happen to go to a holiday home up there regularly, and there's a lovely space up here, and this is a historic space in Simonstown. We've got another map, which I'm calling it the tree map and Treepedia, just to copy the other one. And it's got the same criteria. It's only embryonic. I've done a couple parks here in the Cape Peninsula, the Outspan in Fischhoek and Muizenberg Park. And I'd like to start our own app for that as well, iTree. And this was a grading map, which Bridget O'Donoghue suggested I should start looking at landscape heritage spaces and develop criteria for grading them. So I started doing that. This in particular is looking at the trees. And I've got different systems here for, there are actually a lot of ways of grading trees, but this is a very simple one, which is a star rating. This is the tree map that's online on Google Maps. You can see all the different tree colors are different species. And then if you click on that symbol, you will find a little write-up on that tree. And sometimes they've got a historical write-up and sometimes they haven't. So also landscape heritage routes. We've created the first landscape heritage route. It's got 10 heritage parks and gardens. So it goes from Cape Town to the southern suburbs. It's company gardens to Castelabia. It includes Groot Constantia, the Vineyard, Ardern Gardens, Chart Farm, Wynberg Park, Little Stream, Hohenhort Hotel, Muizenberg, and there are other Muizenberg Park, and there are other routes in progress. And landscape heritage routes, Landscape Heritage SA is creating the first city landscape heritage route series, Cape Town Heritage Gardens. And so I've explained the first one to you, which is the central area to southern suburbs. Got a second one in the central area to Atlantic Seaboard, then the Winelands, and one on the Cape Peninsula. But there are, as you can figure out, there are many kinds of landscape heritage routes that you can create. And we hope to see that these will eventually become standard practice in the cities and regions around South Africa and around the region. Is at the end of naked heritage, the end of heritage without landscape heritage? I hope so. I hope you'll feel less offended about the questions and more offended about the ethical dilemma, for me it is, of heritage minus landscape. And I hope that this will be just the beginning of heritage plus landscape, the beginning of a better understanding of landscape heritage, the cultivated landscape. Thank you.
Bruce, thank you so much. There are a number of questions that I think Herman is starting to post, but I would like to just say a few things. You certainly have provided us with food for thought. My take on it, and I agree with everything you say, absolutely, is that before there were buildings, there was landscape. The landscape evokes all sorts of a full range of responses in any sentient being, or creatures. Our pre-humans, animals, insects, birds. The landscape is significant to all creatures. An approach to heritage which dismisses or devalues this landscape in all of its manifestations is just willfully selective. It's lacking. It's incapable of retelling any complete story at all. And I just don't think the omission of landscape of whatever nature has any place in heritage, in my view. I mean, there is always an archaeological dimension because whatever has grown on the landscape ingests within it records of climate, ingests within it, has the seeds, the food that is consumed. There are records of these things. Plants, particularly trees, are time machines, and they're able to do a lot of measuring. that we desperately need. I don't believe that any HIA should omit a heritage, a landscape component. I think the criteria that you've started to put together, I think should be adopted without question, by all the provincial heritage authorities. And I think there, doesn't have to necessarily be a change in the Act. I just think the heritage authorities should insist on it. As an extension to what is understood. The energy embodiment, which is not something you touched on, but I suspect it underpins a lot of what you say. When we look at the work that the landscape actually does, and we start to give it value, it's possible to give a rands and sense value to items of landscape, to open spaces that is far beyond the 50 Rand a plant kind of aspect. And so I don't want to go on because I'm sure there are lots of other people who would like to ask questions. So I want to really thank you for this wonderfully provocative and insightful presentation. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? The comments are written. There are some comments written, but are there any other verbal questions which you'd like to direct to Bruce? Okay. Well, I see here a wonderful talk by Henry Payne. Thanks, Bruce. Great talk. I'm already running out these. I see Herman has asked for an example of a non-curated, cultivated, native landscaping project you've worked on. I don't notice.
None.
Okay. Well, that's an easy one. All right. But Herman would like to chat some more. So let's see here. Yeah, I mean, I think, you yourself are a botanist in some aspects of your training, but, it's certainly one area where we can all use technology. I can use my phone and it will tell me exactly what species of tree I'm looking at, or what butterfly I've seen, or what blade of, what the grasses are I'm looking at. And so I am able to participate in putting something together. I think in the absence of a set of sort of values, a tree of this size, a tree of this species must be of this and this particular age, and we would give it this particular sort of number and this particular heritage value, so to speak. I can make my own up, but it would be very useful to have criteria that we collectively feed into, like the maps that you're putting together. I mean, they're incredibly useful. And we can all, there's nothing to stop us. In fact, I think we're actually obliged to do it. I would like to think that someone who subscribes to the ethical values of APHP does not submit a heritage impact assessment without a landscape component. And it's something that I will certainly bring up at our next EXCO meeting. Is there some way we can develop that? So are there any other questions, or should we start?
There are a couple. There was two hands up.
Questions. Graham. Okay, I see. I've got one here from Graham. Graham, would you like to go?
Okay. Yeah, it's really more an observation. Thanks, Bruce. I really enjoyed that talk, by the way. There is, I don't know if you covered this. I was having a bit of trouble with my sound, so maybe you did. But there is a situation where you've got a symbiosis between built and let's call it cultivated and grown parts of the landscape. And I think that is also an important point to recognize. Whether it is, for example, an avenue leading up to Lanzerac that happens to be aligned, I believe, very intentionally on De Picke in Stellenbosch, for example, or whether you're talking about something very much more, closer, where you might find a landscape designed landscape feeds off the building, which is part of it, or the building feeds off the landscape. And those can be quite, I mean, of course, I'm speaking very much from my architectural background, but I think those are also very special. Some of the landscapes that you mentioned in your talk, going down the southern, the southern suburbs, do include do have some of those attributes. Thanks, Jonathan.
Pleasure. Thank you. Emmylou?
Yes. Hi. Thank you very much, Bruce. I wanted to sort of like a positive note, which has been quite nice an experience for me in the last while working on cultural landscapes assessments in the Karoo with the wind farms, is that within those processes and those HIAs, I've been able to make recommendations around buffer zones, around sort of cultural planting, where there's been sort of rows of aloes or whatever that have been planted around a farmstead. But also beyond that, in my most recent dealings, which I was quite pleased with, because often in the EIA process one doesn't get the opportunity. But I made recommendations for interviews with the local, with the non-resident landowners, or the non-landowning residents that live on the property. Sorry, I'm just walking those here. And having spoken to them about what plants they use in terms of indigenous knowledge systems, where they use them, which plants they use, where can one find them, and that was actually incorporated into the cultural landscape assessment, which was then taken up and will be taken further in the EIA process. So just on a positive note, I think if one can, push for that early on enough when one is doing these impact assessments, then they do accommodate it, which is fantastic, because it's been a process, but it's nice that it's happening.
Thank you, Emmylou, sorry.
Thanks,
Look, I covered just to jump in here, I covered a lot of ground because I think there's so much ground to cover. So it was a bit of a gamble and a bit of a race. And a lot of those areas could become whole papers in themselves, which I've written. Just I've nowhere to publish them. I actually don't know what to do with them. I'm not an academic, but I think about them a lot as how does a landscape architect and someone with a particular orientation towards landscape react to what is sort of doled out in heritage environment, which is utterly dominated by architecture and archaeology. And so that's why I made those points. But coming back to the overall theme of the symposium, which is the ethical aspect, I have found this extremely difficult with Heritage Western Cape, and I would probably be, I don't know what, if I had to speak my mind out very plainly about the way I think Heritage Western Cape deals with landscape and how IACOM deals with landscape. And I'm talking about my experience in submitting HIAs. And I think that there is a major problem that comes out of the heritage community, the heritage background, and here architecture obviously goes back thousands of years. Archaeology only goes back 100, 150 years. But landscape in heritage, and the whole issue of UNESCO and national monuments and that overbearing character of UNESCO and the cultural landscape has come to dominate and poison, in my mind, if that's not possibly the right word, but to create a great prejudice in heritage planning that is oriented towards architecture, monumentalism, and has not entirely been dealt with by the changing of terms such as monument to heritage sites. And I hope that in the future, as I've started to engage with authorities through Landscape Heritage Southern Africa, I hope in time that we can engage with the authorities such as SARA, who I've done to a certain degree with SARAS and the way they map things, and Heritage Western Cape, to express my concerns and try and explain to them why there is such a bias and what the bias is, because I'm afraid it's utterly it's pernicious, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. I agree. Something that I wanted to just sort of connect a few things together here, because you know, Simon showed us these aerial, quite evocative aerial photographs of Great Zimbabwe, and the mound, the Mugabe mound to the north, if the orientation is correct, and you know, one's dealing with really quite a wonderful landscape there, which is on the verge of being completely wrecked by the intrusive nature of some of those things that have been done already, and if the powers that be have their way, will continue to do so. And you know, I think that what it is important to all of us to deal with the poetic of the landscape. We must understand that, you know, those landscape is, you know, if landscape was flat, it would be extraordinary. You know, we'd probably call it sea or lake, okay? But it isn't. And it is full of meaning at a whole variety of levels, particularly for human beings. And that there is, whether the lightning strikes the high ground in a particular place, whether a certain kind of tree is grown on this side of a ridge or that side, all of these things have meaning. And no matter, in a sense, how sophisticated you might eventually become, they still resonate with all of us. I am absolutely certain that there is a wealth of information, for example, contained within that the greater Great Zimbabwe site, that is written by humans into that landscape, and which the landscape has communicated back to the humans. There is a two-way poetic response, a ritual, spiritual response to that. And you know, it's not just defensive, it's not just religious, it is ceremonial, and you know, all of those things are very important. I also, I mean, I look at, you know, you know, I get HIAs that get referred to me to kind of be critical. I get queries, for example, somebody wants to build something, and it is going to obscure, for example, a long view of Northcliffe Ridge. Now, these are in areas which are zoned for all sorts of commercial activities. You know what I mean? The restrictions, if they are sort of inflated to their full capacity, would start to obliterate a long view of these things. Now, I know there's enough sort of archaeological work done on our copies and our ridges and over here, which make for fascinating study and create huge meaning in the landscape. And that, you know, you can't ignore any aspect of it. You know, whether it is strategic, whether it's been, you know, it's a landscape, an ancient landscape lifted up, you know, like the Magaliesberg, that one, you know, one can just have your breath taken away by the ancientness of the landscape that you're standing on, by, you know, the strategies of hunting, the way the Arpies River cuts through there, the Wonderboom, for example, and then other people eventually find strategic lookouts and make forts and do all sorts of things. You know, the landscape is old, wonderfully old, and it can keep talking to us if we're prepared to listen and not actually obliterate it through our own greed and stupidity. So I really would like to thank you for you know, enlightening us as to the efforts and work that you've done.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, so I think we've got probably pretty much, unless anybody really would like to say something, their chats, which I would like you to go through, which I'm sure you will, Bruce. And I am thinking that it's probably quite a good time to begin to wrap up. And unless I have any other sort of business that has not been covered. That's what I intend to do. Would that be okay with everybody? I'll take yeah, silence as agreement. So I would like, in response to the questions, the very important questions that have been raised, to place on our agenda for the next APHP Exco the notion of directing relevant correspondence with regard to the ethical questions raised here, in whichever way we can, whichever way we think is important. I mean, it might be a response to the membership, saying that these are a particular interests that we like to think that we as heritage practitioners share. Would there be agreement, and could we as an association subscribe to them? I certainly believe we can. So I would certainly think we could circulate those things. I think we can go further. I think we can direct correspondence to the provincial heritage authorities and get them to beef up their HIA requirements with regard to landscape, and try to accommodate some of the things that Bruce has raised here, and perhaps there might be some other things. I'm not. What I do like too is that it was wonderful having Simon coming from north of our border. There's something fantastic about feeling connected to the rest of Africa. There's certainly not enough of that. And so if Simon is still listening or able to hear, I would really like to thank him. And, you know, I do hope that it becomes possible for us to extend our reach north into the continent and try and develop our membership, you know, north of the border, so to speak, and to get the kind of views and to assist with dealing with a number of the problems that you know, keep raising themselves. I mean, you know, one shudders to think what happens in places that's bad enough here at times to worry about these things. So in conclusion, what I would really like to do is to thank our three speakers, Graham, Simon and Bruce, for their fantastic presentations. We've struggled through a bit of technical glitches, which is probably you know, is everyone gets used to that. And I'd also very much like to thank Gavin McLaughlin, Arwen Hallock-Jones, William Martinson, our current chair, and Grace Battis-Martinson, who's our secretary and who's been doing so much of the running around and organization around this particular event. And of course, all of the APHP Exco members who attended and contributed, and you out there, the attendees, thank you so much for your questions. Thanks for participating. And it would be very nice to do this again. And in final closing, I do think there's something wonderful about not having consumed any aeroplane fuel or petrol or damaged the environment. Perhaps we did damage it, but in a very, very slight manner in comparison to other possibilities, and that the costs of this little exercise were extremely minimal. And I do think that in its own way is giving adding ethics to our notion of conservation. So thank you very much. And I wish you all goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much from me. I just want to say to all the organizers, really, really, it was really a very interesting afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Graham. I have been asked by Grace just to be reminded that if you could register and fill in the Google form before the close of the symposium. And you've been given a link on your chat thing to click. So I wonder if you all wouldn't mind doing that. I'm going to do mine now, and then I will close off. Thanks a lot.
Jonathan, just from the EXCO and the APHP members, thank you very much for your very good hosting of this.
It's a pleasure, William. Thank you. Thank you for your help. Okay, last minute.